Hi, welcome back to Don't Forget the Champagne. I'm Nichelle, and this is our Wedding Planning 101 series. Today we're going to be talking about venue and finding the perfect venue for you. I think venue is one of the most important decisions you can make when planning your wedding. It has probably the largest impact overall on your budget, even if it isn't the largest cost on your budget. It's going to determine a lot of other costs down the road, so you want to make sure you pick one that is the best for the wedding style you're going, your budget, and your overall wedding dreams and aspirations. Booking your wedding should be like the first payment you probably make to your overall wedding planning budget. Unless you're hiring a planner, then a lot of times they can help you with that venue search, especially if that's something you're struggling with. There are a few things that you need to have locked down before you book a venue. So the first thing I'd recommend you spend some time figuring out is your guest count. You want to have a pretty close to accurate guest count. So I recommend actually doing a rough draft of a guest list. It doesn't need to be perfect, but 2 weeks ago I talked about how to create your guest list. I think it is great to have an initial draft. I think sometimes we can think that a 100% wedding is going to be perfect, it's going to include everyone we want, and then when we actually start putting people in, it turns out that 100 might be closer to 180. And then you run into a problem if you've already booked your venue and your venue is smaller. So I think it's important not only to have just a rough guest count, but also to have a rough draft of your guest list so you kind of know who is going to be included in that guest count. The other couple things you need to have decided is your overall wedding budget. You need to figure out how much you have to spend, and also a general idea of your wedding style. You don't need to have everything locked down, but it is important to have a general sense of your wedding style so you can make sure that when you're picking a venue, it's going to work well with your style and create a important design element, honestly. So you want to make sure you have a general sense of that. So I have a couple videos on all of those topics already, so make sure you watch those if you have any questions. But if you already have those locked down, then great, let's start talking about venue and how to find one for you. One thing I think you should think about is your must-have list. Are there any particular elements you want to make sure are included in your venue? These can be really big things like, I want an outdoor venue. Obviously, then you're not going to be looking at hotel ballrooms, unless a rooftop is what you're looking for. Maybe they have a rooftop space. But it can be also really small things. A lot of times venues will limit candles or confetti. If those are elements that you really picture as being important to your overall wedding day vision, then you want to spend some time making sure that any venues you have check those boxes. Another big one that we see a lot is pets. A lot of people really want to include their pets in their ceremony, and not all venues will be pet friendly. I feel like that's actually one of the harder things to find a lot of times. So that if that's important to you, make sure to be asking those questions up front so you're not wasting your time looking at venues that don't have your must-haves. Then you want to start researching, looking into your area. The Wedding Wire can be good places to start, but I don't think those should be the only places you look. One of my favorite places to look are wedding photographers, local wedding photographers, their Instagrams and their blogs. They'll have kind of a wide range of wedding locations, and if you find one whose photography style works well with you, then those venues probably also fit your aesthetic. And a lot of times they have a little bit more of a range and maybe have some non-traditional venues that you wouldn't have thought of. Wedding planners can also have good options on their blogs and things as well. Also, I think, especially if budget is a major concern, try thinking outside of the box when it comes to event spaces. One of my favorite weddings that I worked a couple years ago was hosted at a local restaurant, and they were closed on Sundays, so it was a Sunday wedding. They were closed on Sundays, and so they were able to use the whole restaurant. We moved tables out of one section, so they had a dance floor. The food was amazing because it was a restaurant, and it was a really unique event space. They didn't wind up paying a venue fee, they just had a food minimum. So think about doing a non-traditional venue. if there's a restaurant you really love, see if they'd be willing to close down for a wedding. If there is like a place that you've attended a concert that you think is gorgeous, see if they have space for a wedding. It is going to be probably a little bit more work because you're going to have to bring in things you're not as used to planning events, but don't feel limited to those spaces that are typically like wedding event spaces. Make sure you're looking at lots of pictures. Like I said, photographer blogs can be a good place to start. If you found a venue you think you like, try searching that venue's name on Pinterest, or searching that venue's name in Google, but having like photographer after it or blog after it. A lot of times that'll pop up individual weddings rather than just the venue's portfolio. So once you've narrowed your options down to a few options, I think 3 to 5 is probably a good place to start. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with decisions because things will start to blur together and it'll be harder to narrow things down. But once you have 3 to 5 venues that look like they might be a good fit, you want to send out like an initial email with some questions just to make sure that it is fitting kind of your basic requirements before you go and tour. So the things I recommend you ask in those initial contact email is, first of all, ask the cost. A lot of times it'll vary a little bit depending on the season, maybe the day of the week, but they should be able to give you kind of a basic cost. You want to make sure that it fits in your budget. If your budget is $15,000 and the basic cost is $28,000, then probably it's a no. You want to see what size spaces they have available and see if those would work for your guest count. I would avoid doing spaces that are vastly too big or too small. I think obviously too small, you're not going to be able to fit everyone in there, but too big can also be difficult depending on the space. Sometimes you can really make it work, but sometimes it is hard and can feel kind of like cavernous and empty if you have a 30-person wedding and you're putting it in like a 500-person event space. So I would be a little wary of that. Maybe see if you can find some pictures with smaller weddings at this venue if it's something you love. So in that initial email, you need to ask about budget, you need to ask about size of the space, and then if you have any must-haves, check with them up front. Do they allow pets if that's something you're looking for? Do they allow candles if that's something that you're looking for? Do they have a get ready space if that's something that's really important to you? So ask some of those must-have questions. You'll have a chance to ask more later, but if there are any deal breakers, ask those in the initial email so you don't waste their time or your time touring a venue that isn't going to work for you. The next big thing I like to ask, and sometimes you can wait until you actually tour the venue, but if you want to do your research ahead of time, go ahead and ask now. Ask about vendors that you can use. A lot of venues have specific vendor lists. Some of them have like recommended vendors, or some of them will have vendors you're required to use, particularly catering. I find that one is often like, this is our catering team and you have to use them. Spend some time researching them and making sure that that catering team is also going to fit into your budget. Also, if you have any people already booked, so let's say you like love this photographer, you've already booked them, check to see if that would be allowed. A lot of times you're going to be able to negotiate a little bit with some of those other vendors, and even if they're on their preferred list, a lot of times with like a few recommendations, you can get in with those vendors. So another thing you'll want to check is what's included in the cost of your rental. So there are venues that'll have literally everything from the tablecloths to the napkins to the decor to bartenders to a day out coordinator to like anything you can imagine. And then there's more like blank slate venues where you're gonna have to rent everything from tables to chairs to linens to maybe even like a refrigerator for your catering team. So it's really important to kind of be aware of what's included when you're comparing price tags, because they're definitely not always equivalent. So you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. So if you're comparing a full inclusive package to a blank slate, the inclusive package is probably going to be more, but the blank slate venues can often wind up costing a little bit more, especially if they're already on the higher end and what you're envisioning is a little bit more on the higher end and you're gonna have to bring in a ton of stuff. That's gonna wind up adding up pretty quickly. Another thing you should check during that initial email is if they have any dates in your range available. I really don't recommend picking a date before you talk with the venue. Be willing to have some flexibility there, but if you really want like a spring wedding in 2020 and they have no dates available in like March, April, or May, or even June, then that's going to be a problem. And again, don't waste your time touring. So once you kind of talk some of those things out in the initial email, make sure to schedule a visit. Just because something looks beautiful online and in pictures doesn't mean it's going to be a great fit for you once you actually get there. Instagram is not always the same as reality. So I think it's important to schedule a visit. I would schedule visits for no more than 3 venues. I think things start to blur together. You can always schedule like a second round of walkthroughs, but yeah, it can get just like kind of dicey if you are trying to schedule more than that. Okay, so once you have your venues narrowed down, I would recommend you visit them. Like I said, schedule some visits. During your visits, here are my tips for actually visiting the venue. First thing is I would recommend taking so many photos, like more photos than you think you would need. Take a photo of every single space, including like bathrooms and coat rooms and parking lots, because like I said, they'll start to blur together and you'll remember what is where. So if you have photos, you can refer back to them. And I also recommend finding a list of questions. I have one on my website. I'll link it in the description down below, where it's like a list of every single question you should ask, because there's a lot of questions you wouldn't think of, like about like bathrooms and parking and things that are really, really crucial to making sure your event runs really smoothly. So like I said, I will link that below. I actually have a little checklist that you can, or not checklist, but like a questionnaire that you can use as you tour venues to make sure you hit all of the important topics and you have notes on everything that you might need to know. Then sit down and compare the venues you have. Compare things based on prices. Remember to include rental prices in there. You can normally get estimates from Google on like how much it's going to cost to rent a bunch of tables and chairs and things like that. Again, so you're comparing apples to apples and kind of make a pro-con list. There's probably not going to be a venue that's completely perfect for you. Maybe there will be, awesome. But spend some time on this. This is a major decision. I think spending a little bit of time on it is good. I think venues sometimes can try to pressure you to try to book during your visit. I normally don't think that's a great idea. Just because there's a lot of factors to consider and you really want to make sure you have time and space to make sure you're making the best decision based on all those factors. So make sure you're comparing prices, but not just based totally on that like sticker price tag, the base price, but also including venues. If you have to work with a particular caterer, make sure you chat with them before you book. That way you're not stuck with a hugely expensive caterer if that's not going to fit into your budget, or if that's not really what you're envisioning for your wedding day. So venue, vendors that have to be included or are highly recommended, and then look at those pictures and see what would match your vibe. Then go ahead and book your venue. Most venues do require an initial deposit. It'll vary. Normally it's right around 50% to reserve your date, and then your second will be due sometime around your wedding date. But every venue does it a little differently. Some have like a monthly payment structure. So chat with them to figure out what that is going to look like for you. Make sure to save a copy of your contract and also read through it before you sign. I know it's like annoying to read through all these contracts, but it's really important to make sure that you understand what you might be held liable for if there's damages, what is included and what isn't included, what are extra costs, those sorts of things as far as your venue goes. Okay, the final thing I think you should do after you book your venue is spend some time making any notes that you want to make sure you remember. So anything that's limited as far as decor, like I said, a lot of times there's limitations on candles, or like confetti or flower petals and things like that. You want to have a note of that way, because you won't remember it. It's like too much to keep in your head. So make a note of anything like that. Make a note of start and end times. Make just like a note for yourself based on all the things you chatted about when you were booking. That way you can refer back to them when it comes time to start doing those last minute details like the month of your wedding day. Okay, that is all I have for venue. Hopefully that covered kind of the basics. I know it was a lot. I also have a couple blog posts about venue if you want to have it in writing. I'll link those below, as well as our venue walkthrough checklist. Let me know if you have any other questions or if there are any specific wedding planning topics that you want me to focus on. Next week we're going to be talking about photographer, which is a fun one. So look forward to that. We'll have a big conversation about photographers and maybe even videographers. We'll see. I haven't written the outline for that one yet. So if you have any questions about that, you can also always send me an email at dftcevents@gmail.com if you have any wedding planning questions or if you would like to work with me. I will see you guys next week. Bye.